Welcome to this C1 Youth Culture screencast, looking at gender and youth cultures. So at the beginning of the last screencast, we highlighted that one of the problems with the critical cultural studies approach that dominated the early academic analysis on British youth subcultures was that it focused primarily on white working class males at the expense of other groups. And this is one of the reasons that women are largely invisible in the early research that was carried out on British youth subcultures. Now, one of the reasons that girls are largely invisible in the early research on British youth subcultures is that girls have played a smaller role in street-based subcultures compared to boys. So these subcultures traditionally have been dominated by boys in line with the patriarchal relationships found within society in general. So although girls did join in with the spectacular youth subcultures of the past, so as we can see with this picture, there were, for example, female skinheads, there were female mods, for instance, the rate of participation by girls was very much lower than the rate of participation by boys. So, for example, skinhead and mod cultures were predominantly male, and what is more, they were organised around a distinctly masculine style. So, for example, according to Cohen's semiotic analysis of the skinhead culture, skinheads wore an exaggerated version of traditional male working class clothes, composing of cropped hair, braces, drainpipe jeans, and heavy Doc Marten boots. So their clothes represented both a caricature and reassertion of solid, masculine working class toughness. And similarly, their attitudes, their behaviour, typified by the use of aggression and violence, were based on a hyper-masculine style. So according to feminists, there are several reasons why girls have traditionally played a smaller role in street-based youth subcultures. So girls, for example, are much more tightly controlled by parents and by their local community. So there's the ever-present fear of getting into trouble, especially sexual trouble. So for boys, taking risks is exciting, whilst for girls it's potentially much more dangerous. And the result is that girls have less of a public street life and are more confined to the home. And furthermore, within the home, they're often expected to carry out more domestic tasks than their male counterparts, which gives them less spare time. So in the past, it was simply not possible for many girls to engage in leisure activities which were perceived to be dirty, dangerous, or hedonistic. However, although feminist writers such as McRobbie and Garber argued that girls played a smaller role in street-based subcultures compared to boys, they speculated that girls might have their own culture, separate from the male-dominated street-based subcultures. And the research carried out by McRobbie and Garber in the 1970s indicates that girls were involved in a distinctive youth culture of their own, which they described as a bedroom culture, since it involves girls spending time in their bedrooms, often in pairs rather than in gangs on the street, where girls will listen to music, experiment with makeup, discuss sex and relationships, pop stars, and the latest gossip. And I think this notion of a bedroom culture once again reflects this general idea that young people are attracted to youth cultures as a way of resolving the problems that they face. So feminist researchers such as McRobbie and Garber argued that due to the socialisation of girls and the supervision that they undergo during their adolescence, they have to adopt a bedroom culture, because the bedroom is a space into which girls retreat away from the outside world and away from the risk of being humiliated or harassed by boys. So the bedroom is a space where young women can exercise a degree of autonomy within a culture where the activities of girls are highly controlled and regulated. Now, McRobbie and Garber's research was done during the 1970s and focused on the relationship between this bedroom culture and a very commercial teeny bopper pop culture of the 1970s, which centred on pop idols such as Donny Osmond and David Cassidy. However, there are perhaps more contemporary equivalents of this bedroom culture. For example, research carried out in Manchester by Lincoln in the 1990s found that a bedroom culture still existed. The bedroom was still a place where girls cultivated friendships with other girls. However, she found that girls' bedrooms were no longer as private as they once would have been. So television and access to the internet were common, and so the outside world was allowed in. And furthermore, she found that girls no longer excluded males from their bedrooms, as they were now much more likely to allow boyfriends in, although they remained predominantly female territory. And perhaps we can now talk about the existence of a new bedroom culture. So this is the idea of the internet replacing the idea of a slumber party, because it allows girls to maintain relationships through social mediums in addition to face-to-face contact. So young people are able to strengthen, solidify and coordinate their relationships through wireless communication devices and access to the internet. And of course this has consequences for those young people who don't have access to these types of devices, because without ownership of things like smartphones, a young person cannot expect to be a meaningful part of the social networks that these devices entail. Now, other sociologists have argued that in addition to the neglect of the particularly feminine bedroom culture, sociologists have actually underestimated the role of women within other types of youth cultures that have previously been thought to be predominantly male. For example, Reddington argues that there is perhaps no better example of male hegemonic control over popular cultural history than the rewrite of punk to exclude the very large and productive presence of young women in this subculture from the very beginning. So, for example, punk fashion was strongly influenced by the female fashion designer Vivienne Westwood, and there were numerous punk bands that were either all female or had prominent female members. And examples would include Susie and the Banshees, The Adverts, and the band that we can see on this particular slide, The Slits. And therefore many feminists have suggested that the neglect of females in youth subcultures may be partly a result of their lack of participation in some subcultures, but it is also partly due to their neglect by predominantly male researchers. And feminist writers such as Christian Griffin argue that much of the sociology of youth subcultures has been almost exclusively concerned with males, that women and girls, as in much of traditional sociology, are rendered invisible. And feminists use the term male-stream knowledge when they're describing this masculine bias within sociology. Now, in her more recent work, McRobbie argues that young women are increasingly reclaiming public space and asserting more control over sexuality as they experience more economic and social opportunities within society. And some researchers and cultural commentators have even talked about girl power. And one example of this is the rise of the so-called ladette, the female counterpart of the lad. And the rise of the ladette is sometimes seen as evidence that female and male youth cultures are becoming more similar, that we've seen some convergence. Also, the availability of mobile communications may have increased the involvement of women within public or street-based youth cultures. For example, the World Youth Report of 2003 notes that mobile communication creates what one might call an extended umbilical cord between youth and their parents. So what parents most appreciate about mobile communications is the possibility of constant communication, not the constant communication itself. Thus, these new technologies give parents the security of a lifeline to their daughters, but at the same time, these wireless phones also give young women the greater levels of privacy and independence that they might crave. So the involvement of women in public youth cultures from the 1990s onwards has been much more visible and prominent. For example, in her work on dance music culture, Sarah Thornton argues that clubbing culture dissolved structural divisions such as class, race and gender as the dance floor crowd became collectively immersed in the club experience. And she argues that in relation to dance music culture, from the start, it's girls who are much more likely to go clubbing and to become immersed in this particular public youth culture. However, Thornton also recognises that even within dance music culture, women still have less status than men. For example, most of the famous DJs within this culture tend to be male. Also, although girls are perhaps less tightly controlled than they were in the past, the marginal position of women can still be seen in some contemporary youth cultures. For example, there are very few female MCs within hip-hop youth cultures, and gangster rap, which is the most commercially successful subgenre of hip-hop, has been criticised for its overt misogyny and hypermasculinity. So misogyny within gangster rap refers to lyrics, videos, or other aspects of the culture that support, glorify, justify, or normalise the objectification, exploitation, or victimisation of women. However, many other youth cultures have not adopted an overtly masculine style. For example, groups such as goths and emos are androgynous in terms of their style, meaning neither male or female.